Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start, so if you can please take your seats. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. My name is Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, and I will be moderating this session. I am the co-president of the Club of Rome. And one of the reasons why I believe that this is such an incredibly important event, one is clearly we are marking Gender Day, which is very important. But most importantly, we are also marking the importance of ensuring that capital flows are gender smart, that we bring in the socially inclusive climate finance angle in all of our thinking across the MDBs, across public finance, and across private finance. There is clearly an urgent need to accelerate gender smart and socially inclusive climate finance. So many of us have been in a variety of different events this week, but also prior to this COP. The discussion around women, both their role in being in the front lines of the most vulnerable zones, and usually the ones that actually are the most vulnerable from the impacts of climate change, but also the ones that are bringing community solutions, that are bringing very new types of solutions across the board to build resilience across their communities. And that is why this is such an important event. We must remember that this time of complexity, when we are facing the multiple effects of COVID, the pandemic, climate change, and also conflict, that it is often women that are on the front lines, and because of their broader system view, are bringing forward solutions to these complex challenges. And we will have more of them. This is the new normal, and therefore enhancing the role of women, acknowledging the need to transfer funds to female-driven projects, and those that are also bringing women to the forefront as the solution providers is absolutely fundamental. There are so many examples across the globe that demonstrate the role of women. The diversity in leadership, in workforce, in supply chains, in development projects, we know that this brings better results across the board. We also know that women in decision-making at the highest levels are thinking through in very different ways. Just an example, the well-being economies are all driven by women. 5 incredible governments who have decided that we need to shift beyond just GDP growth and take into consideration socially driven, environmentally driven, and new economic indicators that ensure that they service people. So today, as we address the need for finance, and we look at how we can approach this from a gender-smart lens, I'm very proud to be here to lead you through what I think is an incredible program, bringing together some of the most incredible voices, but doers, who are very much looking at this issue. Let me start by welcoming the Vice President of the European Environment Bank, who actually, Ambroise Fayal, will let us know a little bit what the EIB is doing in this area. Ambroise, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Oops, yeah. Thank you so much, Sandrine. I think you've, interestingly, you have called the European Investment Bank the European Environment Bank, which actually is what we would like to transform the bank in. So many thanks for that. And many thanks to all of you who are here today. I'll be short. I will be also very much looking forward to listen to what my friend Monica Scatasta has to say on this from the Council of Europe Bank. On my side, there are 2 points that I would like to stress. And starting by one fact, which is it is not only environmentally good, socially just, to increase the projects that we do supporting women. it is also good economics. I'm not going to give you statistics, but it is clear that when women are in projects, when they are running companies, etc., what we see is that the results are better. So this is also something that as a bank we are supporting, of course. And actually, the 2 points I would like to make, the first one is clearly at the bank, at the European Investment / Environment Bank, we have put in the Climate Bank roadmap strengthening gender-smart climate financing as one of our priorities. And it started with projects. It started with also an initiative that was launched last year. In terms of project, I would say we have a great project, especially in Africa, that is called She Invest. And that supports many, many projects for different scale in Africa where there is the support to female entrepreneurship. And actually, it was launched, when was that? 2 years ago. We had an objective of 2 billion euros. And to my surprise, I must say, the full envelope was exhausted this year. So what we have decided, and it was announced at the Finance in Common Summit 2 weeks ago in Abidjan, is that we would double it. And we have already signed the next envelope of 2 billion euros to speed up on investing for female entrepreneurship in Africa. What we have also launched last year is the 2X Gender and Climate Finance Guide. We did that with EBRD and with the British BII. And this is a guide to help design how we can speed up investment. One example that I found very interesting in the aftermath of this guide is an example in Brazil, which is Neoenergia. This is a fund to support Brazilian renewable energy companies, which has a specific target for leadership and empowerment of women. And actually, their target is 35% of the leadership has to be held by women by 2030. And it is accompanied by two things that I think are very important. One is the human resources policies that is actually making this possible at all levels in the company, but also they have put in place an electrician school that is targeting women, just to show that you don't need to be a man to be an electrician, something that really would probably be good also outside Brazil. So that's my first point. There is a lot of initiatives. It's really moving forward, and that's good. It's probably not enough. The second thing is it is not enough because what we see is that climate change itself has an impact that exacerbates the existing gender inequalities. And that's why we need to do more. I mean, when you look at farmers, it's clear that the female farmers receive less investment, their farms are smaller, etc. So you need to do more in terms of adapting technologies, and that's what we try to do at EIB. I would just like, because examples say more than words normally, I would like to signal one initiative that we have, which is Blue Orchard. It is supporting microfinance led by women. And we include that, it's for farmers, a gender response climate risk insurance for women, so that they are not in disadvantage with male counterparts, if I may say so. So a lot of initiatives. Congratulations to the team that within the EIB is working on that. Excellent job. I will stop there because I would very much like to listen what others have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you are right. I guess my Freudian slip of calling the EIB the Environment Bank is also because you are Europe's climate bank. So, you know, there is something very synergetic here. And you are also very right that we are moving forward in starting to see the incredible role that women play and the need to ensure both microfinance and macro-financial tools are used to enhance that role. But by the same token, we've seen that the Climate Policy Institute is indicating very clearly that actually only 5% of private, public, and blended climate finance was gender responsive. And yet, we've looked at ODA finance, and 57% of climate finance that's channeled through the ODA was gender responsive. So there's a disconnect between the money going in and yet what we're seeing on the other side. And what I want to do is turn to my dear friend Monica Scatasta. I think Monica's supposed to be online with us right now. Monica, are you here? Now, Monica is supposed to be putting, apologies.
Can you hear me?
Monica will be putting a spotlight on the social gender climate nexus and will address some of the key messages coming out of new findings from the OECD and the CPI reports. Monica, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you too, Sandrine. Thank you very much. I hope people can hear me. I unfortunately hear a bit of an echo, so I'll try to make do. Well, let me start, first of all, by saying that the Council of Europe Development Bank, or the CEB, as I will call it from now on, is delighted to co-host this event with the EIB and Hivos. And indeed, I've been asked to frame today's discussion. I think both Sandrine and Vice President Fraiol did so very eloquently already, particularly as regards gender-smart climate finance. So allow me to widen the lens a little bit. What I would like to discuss is to address the broader social inclusion climate change nexus today, and why they must be seen as a single agenda. I firmly believe that without climate action, the development agenda is in peril, but without a focus on social inclusion, the climate agenda may be in peril. And as Sandrine already said, today's topic is crucial for this COP, a COP of action, of accelerating adaptation, of addressing inequalities. And when we look at addressing inequalities, yes, it's inequalities across countries. We're the African continent that loses 5 to 15% of GDP because of climate impacts. Yes, is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions. But it's also about inequalities within countries. The climate crisis is a social crisis. As you've said, it exacerbates inequalities, including in high-income countries, including in Europe, some of our clients, as global crises do. We saw it with COVID-19. We see it again with the impacts of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So something is amiss in the system. And I think this is what we need to discuss today. And this is actually something that may explain why we're not going at scale yet. Something is amiss in the system. Today's topic clearly is not just important for the COP, it's a natural approach to the Council of Development. The CEB is the only multilateral development bank with a uniquely social mandate. Our mandate is to support social cohesion in our 42 member countries with a special focus on the most vulnerable. And therefore, we address all issues, including climate change, through a people-centered lens. And we've developed in our mandate, within our mandate, in our approach to aligning with the goals of the Paris Agreement, which we've done at record speed. We've committed in 2020 and developed our roadmap by 2021. We've done so by defining the specific social lens to our climate action, what we call the social inclusion climate change nexus. And this is now embedded in our strategic framework for the next 5 years. I think this is very, very important for the Social Bank of Europe, that this nexus is now embedded as part of our strategy, and that climate change and gender equality are two of the three cross-cutting themes that we will mainstream over the next 5 years. And this is because we firmly believe that an integrated social climate nexus approach can leverage positive social transformation by focusing on and involving vulnerable people. This is indeed what also has been identified specifically as regards gender equality by the OECD report that you were mentioning, Sandrine, on gender smart climate action, that indicating how this is really a smart business. But I want to do one thing, if you allow me. I would like to unpack a little bit the concept of the nexus, because it's complex, and I would like, and I hope that we will hear this from the panelists as well. Taking a nexus approach means doing basically three things. First and foremost, understanding the interaction between vulnerability dimension and climate change, climate action, and transition. But also having a mutual mainstreaming of climate consideration and social consideration. Climate consideration in social investment, social consideration in climate action. We don't do enough of that. And then to seek opportunities for actions with that support multiple positive outcomes, social and climate. The IPCC assessment report in 2022 as regard impacts clearly recognized that climate change impacts people in vulnerable situations differently. And therefore, we need to do more in adaptation, as you said, and the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda is encouraging in this sense, but we need to do more investment in socially inclusive adaptation that benefits the most vulnerable and increases adaptive capacity of the most vulnerable. And we must avoid the increasing inequalities that descend from maladaptation, such as the potential that we see due to climate gentrification, for instance, in so many urban areas in the world. In this sense, I would like to throw out that the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, interestingly, in its infrastructure heading, does not consider the adaptation and resilience of crucial social infrastructure, such as school, hospitals, social care facilities. We know how important these are for women, girls. We know that even in Europe, the EEA most recent report on just resilience showed, the 10% of schools and hospitals in Europe are exposed to climate-related hazard. Something is amiss. But we also have inequalities in transition opportunities, reaping transition opportunities. Vulnerable groups not only may face disproportionate costs, but also have difficulties in reaping these benefits, and therefore, in our climate responses, we must design responses that enhance the capacity of vulnerable groups to reap the benefits. You were mentioning already the importance of thinking about education, upskilling, reskilling for women, creating new jobs in the green transition for women, STEM education for girls, but also working with financial intermediaries so that we really make sure that we support non-stranded jobs for women, including through microfinance. We work, for instance, with MIBOSPA in Bosnia and Herzegovina, working with a lot of women in the agriculture sector, and working with our counterparties, including in microfinance, can be crucial in really making a difference in creating non-stranded jobs. One point that I would like to make also is that the mainstreaming of social consideration in climate action is fundamental, also because when we invest in climate action in social sector, for instance, we cannot and should not forget the focus on generating social outcomes. We cannot invest in energy efficiency in yesterday's schools. We need to think of what social outcomes we want to really achieve. And in this sense, the full participation of women, as you said, as leaders, as teachers, as students, as employees, entrepreneurs, consumers is so fundamental. As regards, therefore, why this may not be happening more, I think we all agree that this is fundamental. Why is this not happening at scale? CPI reports indeed indicated that very, very small percentages of climate action is gender tagged, and maybe a bit more for adaptation, but much more needs to be done. I think that we need to do more, not just in terms of gender tagging, but in terms of really understanding impacts, and also in extending this effort for finding data and better understanding the interaction between our climate action and social inclusion beyond gender issues as well, across all the vulnerable groups. Let me conclude just by saying one thing. I think that there are, as I said, something is amiss in the system, because addressing climate change, fostering social inclusion, and achieving gender equality and women empowerment together face two key obstacles. First, they're about, and they require a redistribution of power at multiple levels. It's about power, giving more power, voice, agency to women, but also to other vulnerable groups and vulnerable countries. We can see clear how difficult this is, and not just as part of the COP27 negotiation, a redistribution of power. The second is that we need systemic thinking and action across sectors, across levels of governance. And this is something that we don't do very well in our economic system, in our political systems, and even within financial institutions. So this is a challenge that I would like to throw out there for the panel. How can we do that? How can we work together to really create the knowledge, to create the example, to share the experience, to support better policymaking, to support the long-term strategies, NDCs, national adaptation plans that take this aspect into consideration? How can we support the design of projects that take these aspects into consideration from the get-go and throughout implementation? And how can we work and include final beneficiaries in this design, in this dialogue, and so that we can achieve much better outcomes? I stop here because I think I've gone on for way too long, but I hope it shows that the passion that I have for this topic. And so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Monica. Absolutely. And as I transition now to our panel discussion, let me thank you, Monica, for bringing up the P word, which is power. And actually, if we look at power distribution, but if we also look at the focus of profit, we know that we're not generating prosperity. And this is the 3 Ps that we need to think about, is actually shifting from power and profit and patriarchy into people, planet, and prosperity. And as you have so rightly said, Monica, the social aspect of this is fundamental. We saw through COVID that those that were on the front lines of the care community, supposedly a parallel economy, were actually the ones that were saving our lives. They were there to ensure that actually we all could get access to health care, we all could be taken care of while we were suffering from the gravest pandemic that we've ever seen this century. So I think it's very important as we shift now into this panel discussion to understand the way in which we can create an integrated approach to solutions in looking at poverty, inequality, and empowerment at the same time, which actually turns out to be 3 of the key turnarounds from our new book that we just published with Johan Rockström called Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity. Because we realized through our modeling that it is the social tipping points, and this is where you are so right, Monica. It's the social tipping points that will hit us first, even before the environmental tipping points. We're already seeing the environmental tipping points, but the backlash due to increased poverty across all continents. Let's not forget we are dealing with energy poverty right now on the European continent, will be a problem. So how do we design our financial systems to uphold the shift, to take into consideration the absolute importance of gender finance? That is the discussion that we are now moving into. And I would start with Amal Lee, because Amal Lee, you have been a front runner in thinking through some of these discussions. And we've had many discussions ourselves, and it's such a pleasure to have you here. As Managing Director and Head of Climate Change of the British International Investment, you clearly understand where some of this is actually happening. And you also can speak a little bit about some of the developments that you're seeing that are moving in the right direction.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm sorry, Monica, you're not here in person. I was looking forward to seeing you after such a long time. But it's great to be here on this panel. So we at BII, we actually renamed. So prior to this year, we were the CDC group. So quite a well-known, very well-known investor in Africa and South Asia in particular. And actually, last year at COP26, we were delighted to join EIB and EBRD and others to launch the 2X Green Toolkit, as the Vice President just referred to earlier. And we see that as a really important tool to enable us to look to prioritize the types of investments that can bring gender and climate together. We know, I mean, when we look at the investments we've made this year, they're still relatively small scale, but we're starting to make progress. But I think what's really important about that tool is it allows us to better understand why we should be prioritizing the gender lens in our investing. A key learning is that actually women decision makers will tend to prioritize sustainability. Of course, also, particularly when we look at the adaptation gender, and I know obviously here the discussions around loss and damage, that women and children are disproportionately impacted. So I think for us at BII, this is a big priority, and we have set a climate target and a gender target. But I think moving forward, what I hope is that we can ensure that we're bringing the two together as much as possible. I do think, and I wanted to say a little bit about how this process influences what we do as development finance practitioners. And I think having worked in a multilateral development bank and now in a DFI where we only do private investments, I think what's been really increasingly clear to me is that we need a better framework of incentives for the development finance community, as well as then ultimately the private sector. And at the moment, the focus on this 100 billion has been primarily to incentivize us to go for the big volume tickets, so big investments, which typically tend to be in bigger middle-income countries. And I think what's been really missing is the incentives to drive a more inclusive climate finance agenda. So I know there's been a lot of talk around the role of how to look at the quality of climate finance. I've been involved in the Vera Songway, Lord Nicholas Stern independent high-level expert group. And I think one of the issues there that's been identified is the need to focus on quality as well as looking at the quantity of climate finance. And I really do believe having internally, we're having these conversations. I see my colleague Ellen here, who's in particular been looking at how do we balance out the focus on climate and inclusive. And what I think we're saying, and we recognize it shouldn't be either or, it should be both. But most of the incentives that we've received from this process do not necessarily incentivize inclusive investments. And those typically tend to be smaller scale, harder to do, and probably often with higher risk as well. So we need to recognize that the incentive framework that emerges, the normative framework, if you like, that 100 billion, I think, successfully has created a driver for trying to get scale of investments. We now need to balance it with a framework that also it prioritizes and encourages us and requires us to report on the inclusiveness of our climate finance investments. I do think that will be essential, and I'm happy to say a bit more on that.
Thank you so much, Amalie. And I now want to turn to you, Runa, because you're the co-founder and CEO of Development Partners International. And what both Monica and Amalie are very much pointing to is the fundamental need to shift capital and to enable women to be the solution providers. Now, we are in what we call now this decade of action. There's a sense of urgency. So can you tell us a little bit from your perspective, in terms of a private equity firm, how we can scale this up and also de-risk these investments?
Sure. Thank you very much.
You need to push, yeah.
Thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to be here. So I'm different, I think, on this panel because every day I get up and I think about how to increase returns to my investors. Guess what? There's about 300 trillion of capital dollars of capital in the world that are like me, 150 of which are managed capital. In order to make a real impact and to scale up, that's the capital that has to really be committed to climate change and gender balance. So how do we think about it? We think about it in the following way. So we've been doing this since inception 15 years ago. For me, 23 years ago when I started investing in Africa. Our industry in Africa was started by development institutions like the EIB. And so from the beginning, 23 years ago, not 2015 when the SDGs came, but since the late 1990s, we've been focusing on impact and ESG. As the terminology changed and as things became even more important, we made very clear decisions in the following way. We do ESG. We think of ESG as risk mitigation. So on the environmental side, we think about how to work with our companies to mitigate the risk that water disappearing will stop a pharmaceutical factory. We think about social, how it will impact the community and the workforce. It's risk mitigation, and we've done that since we started. But we also think about separately, because that works better for us, about impact. And we decided to adopt 3 impact buckets. One is gender. We are the first and flagship fund on the 2X challenge. 2 is climate change. And 3 is job creation and quality. Now, we invest throughout Africa, so these 3 items we thought would have the biggest impact, and also it's something that we could work on because we had been doing that for many years. And so intentionality, measure, and also report. On the measurement, we made a decision that we wanted to be compared to everyone else, just like our returns. On the financial side, we're compared on internal rates of return, and on the impact side, we wanted to be compared on some commonly understood measurement system. So it's not just our measurement and we can always meet it. We have to strive for something. So on gender, it's 2X. 50% of our companies now in our ADP3 fund are 2X companies, and we're working on all of them. On climate change, it's the greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1 and 2, but we're using other things also. On job creation, now that's a little easier. We measure. We're a growth fund, and every year we do add jobs, even during COVID. But then, as my colleague said, well, we do that because we buy growth companies and we help them grow. But we also have to challenge ourselves on quality. How do we do that? Quality of the job, occupational safety, making sure wealth creation exists on all income levels, making sure there's career development. We start with the fundamentals when it comes to gender of non-discrimination policies, whistleblowing policies, making sure, depending on where the companies are and what they do, that it's safe for women. So, and we measure every year increased jobs, increased number of women. So in the private sector, there has to be a passion, there has to be very specific guidelines and commitment and intentionality, seriousness to be able to measure. How do we scale up? We scale up by example, demonstration effect. We scale up by governments giving incentives. We scale up by investors like the development institutions, but also in the private sector, the pension funds and others. And we see this happening now. Sovereign funds asking their fund managers to really work in this way. And we scale up by excellent communication on how to do it, by example, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Very interesting that your taxonomy of what needs to happen doesn't bring in education. I'm going to come back to that and see where you integrate education, because Monica also stressed the education aspect, and this is also very important in the work that we've been doing. But I want to now turn to Amr, especially as we're here in Egypt, and because typically we have a token woman on a panel, or they are only male panels, we now have token 2 men. And we're apologies that you need to leave, Vice President, so I want to thank you for coming, because you're more than a token man. You're a very important man. Thank you very much for your ambition through the EIB in terms of what you do for gender-smart impact investing. But I'm going to now turn to you on this panel of women, because clearly we also need gender-smart men, and that's why you're here.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Actually, I will just start with a dear friend of mine met me in the morning today, and he said, "What are you doing on a panel with all women? This is the National Council for Women. They should have sent a woman." So he said, the first thing you should say is to apologize for everyone that you are sitting here, because we didn't find any other women to bring. But I said, no, this is wrong. This is what we want to change. And thanks to what you've been saying, because seriously, women are not going to be able to do this on their own. And if we are not going to support this really heavily and strongly in total belief, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. So just to start and to answer your question really, and I want to take this opportunity because as the COP here, we understand that this is the COP of action, and the slogan is actually implementation together or for together. So basically what I want to say today is to share with you an experience that we have been doing at the National Council for Women to try to reflect on all the objectives that we wanted to streamline in the areas of women, financial inclusion, environment, and climate, because they're all actually very well interconnected. Let me start by asking a question. Is everyone aware with what is the Village Saving and Lending Association program? This is basically where rural women get together in groups during an annual cycle. They meet weekly, they save together, and they lend each other. And basically, it's a safety net for these women to have immediate access to finance within the villages where this is actually not available today. The VSLA model has started actually in the world about 25 years ago, introduced to Egypt around 15 years ago. I was personally introduced to this model about 5-6 years ago, and I was really shocked with the numbers that I've seen. At that time, when we looked at the project, there was about 20,000 women participating in the VSLA model in Egypt across 1,000 groups and 5 governorates, and the amount that they had saved actually in 10 cash boxes was almost 5 million Egyptian pounds. At that time, that was a little bit over $500,000 in circulation, that lending each other through these 10 cash boxes. Immediately at the NCW, when we saw this opportunity, we thought this is something major that we cannot neglect. This is basically a ground readiness that we need to invest in, try to scale up this model, because over 10 years, only 20,000 women could actually participate. This was a very weak number as a volume. And the idea was really, and the challenge here was basically that there was no technology involved at all. These women were using extremely basic tools to collect their money and sit together, but the amount of persistence and meticulousness and how they were keen to attend all those meetings made us at NCW believe that this can be a foundation for something much bigger. And this is what we actually did. We partnered with the Central Bank of Egypt because we could not do this on our own. We were looking forward to change the tin box into a bank account. We wanted to create an ecosystem, a financial ecosystem, where these ladies actually will be formalized and these groups can actually act in a formal way. Because without having all this legality frameworks and all the foundation that I'm talking about, there will not be possible dimensions to grow and scale projects like my dear friends were talking here. Because we've been actually entrenched for the last 20 years in building so much in terms of proof of concept projects that actually many of them have succeeded very well. But until today, I did not see physically something that had scaled up to the millions out of these proof of concepts. And this is basically our objective at the NCW. So once we put this in perspective, adding the technology factor was a really an incredible addition, because certainly today we could, the moderators that were managing the groups, instead of managing 1 to 2 groups per annual cycle, today one supervisor lady from the village is managing 20 groups, and each group has 20 women. That's 400 women that she is managing with the application that we have built from a technology perspective. So why am I saying all this? What does this really have to do with what we are talking here about climate change, environment projects, and so on and so forth? I will actually stop here to give just an opportunity for my dear colleagues to continue, and I will take probably the second part to explain to you how we built all the climate and environment friendly concept on top of the financial inclusion ecosystem there. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And also for sticking to time. This is quite an effective panel. Already you can see that we're very direct in what we want to achieve. So I actually want to build on this in particular, the financial inclusion element, but also understanding the civil society perspective and how we can do things on the ground and optimize all of these different efforts, because that's part of what we need to do, right? To scale in order to ensure that we have radical new partnerships across public-private partnerships in particular. So I'm going to turn to you, Anne, and you're coming in from Hivos and the civil society perspective. If you can reflect a little bit on the types of interventions that you're hearing here, and then where do you see the role of civil society?
Thanks so much, Sandrine. I actually want to start by flipping the frame a little bit for us this morning, because in this type of event, we're so used to portraying women as the takers of climate funding, the passive recipients, the ones in need. Actually, they are net suppliers of climate funding. There's research by IIED this year showing that poor women-headed households in rural Bangladesh are spending 30% of their outgoings on climate adaptation, which is proportionately much more than any other actor in the system. And that's not even counting the costs of cleaning up after storms and floods. And it's not even counting the costs that Monica referred to, the social care infrastructure that has already been underfunded for so many years, that women are having to pick up the pieces of as it comes under increasing strain with climate impacts. So women are already net suppliers of climate finance, but they are woefully under-resourced in this challenge, and in a way that is not good for gender equality, not good for the economy, and not good for the planet either. First of all, women have very few resources to be able to invest adequately in more resilient, longer-term forms of adaptation that would give them meaningful resilience to climate change impacts. Secondly, the impacts on them and their daughters are devastating, because they are having to choose between measures like lifting the floors in their homes to stay safe from the next flood and productive assets, investing in healthcare or education for their daughters. So it's having devastating impacts on gender equality. And finally, the sorts of tough choices that women are having to make mean that both social and natural ecosystems are put under further and further strain. So clearly this needs to change, and as other speakers have said, it needs to change with urgency and at scale. The second point that I wanted to make, though, is that for this to change for women on the ground in countries like Bangladesh and throughout the global south, we need fundamental reform of the international financial architecture at all levels. And thank you so much for your mention of women as drivers of system change, because it's clear that the changes needed cannot only happen at the national level, and we need to start by rethinking the whole climate finance architecture. We need a climate finance architecture that is designed to provide grant funding for loss and damage and adaptation to the countries that have done least to cause climate change, as well as long-term concessional loans for just transition. And initiatives such as those proposed by Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and the call by African finance ministers for debt restructuring, as well as climate reparations, need to be taken very seriously if we want to look at gender transformative funding. And these need to be connected. And I think Monica's point is so important to keep in mind, that at all levels, from the very local level of decision-making about climate finance to the international level, it is ultimately about power and agency and who has a seat at the table. So I think your point, Amal, about changing the incentives and the rules for financing institutions is incredibly important. And that's what we found in our research at Hivos, is that the rules, the modalities, the criteria, even the application processes exclude women on the ground from being able to access the funds that they need. And those incentives need to change. But we also need change in the overall decision-making power. Who sets those incentives and who's at the table when those incentives are decided? So I hope that, first of all, when it comes time for COP28, that we won't be just having one Gender Day, that every day will be Gender Day, and that in the future, every climate grant and loan has a gender objective, and that for every bit of climate financing, we can say that women's movements and other rights holder organizations have been meaningfully involved in the design and decision-making around that finance.
Thank you so much, Anne, and I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we absolutely need to make every day have an integrated approach which takes into consideration diversity and brings in the gender lens. And that needs to be a call, and in fact, today, on Gender Day, the She Call for Action, which is many of us as women have signed, indicating that women have to be in decision-making positions, but part of the entire design of the way in which we look at our economies and our financial systems. That's very important. I also really appreciate what you've said in terms of the criteria rules that for the moment truly exclude actually women both asking for money and also receiving the funds once they do get the money and having enough of it to do what they need to do. And I want to turn to you, Faith, because you represent a Pan-African feminist leadership development organization. And it'd be interesting to have a bit of a reflection from you personally, whether you yourself have had difficulty in getting the finance that you need to do some of your work, and how you see the current climate finance. And yeah, good.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. So obviously the reason why I was interested in this particular panel is because we were going to discuss how we can better integrate gender. One of the things that we do at Akina Mama Africa, where I work, is to challenge different actors to begin to reimagine usual ways of gender mainstreaming and to begin to think about how we and they can be able to integrate a feminist analysis to address development issues and from the root cause of these particular problems and to be able to advance just and inclusive solutions. The climate finance landscape for me, I would say it has dominated the conversation at COP. And one of the things that's clear is that it's really, one of the things being advanced is loan financing, but also the idea of leveraging on private finance. I know that by the time we came here, developed countries hadn't met the 100 billion US dollar commitment. African countries are making a case for additional finance, and we are looking at 1.3 trillion US dollars. And the question basically is, how do we ensure that we have financing models that will not exacerbate already existing inequalities? And so for us, just to summarize what we would like is, we would like debt-free climate finance, like Anne has indicated, but also decolonial, anti-capitalist, flexible, and long-term financing. When you think about the idea of leveraging on private finance, it's really because the developed countries have indicated that there is no sufficient financing for them to be able to deliver the kind of financing that is being demanded to address the climate crisis. So the idea really is to look at how we leverage on private finance. So that then means that we are looking at an approach of blended finance. When we reflect on, because the approach of blended finance is something that has been promoted, even in terms of financing the SDGs, because again, there was a recognition that there's not sufficient amounts. But the challenge then that is presented is how we are then able to balance between private sector interests and the social interests. And I think that is something that really, really needs to be put into consideration. And this is why for us it's more than just saying how many women are receiving part of this money. It's also about, like Monica said, really thinking through the power dynamics, because even with the climate crisis, it has actually increased the power imbalances that exist. One of the things that we do at AMWA is to also, like I indicated, when we talk about the feminist approach, it's really to think about how some of the proposals being advanced, and in this case, the climate finance approach, financing approaches, whether they are contextual and whether they are applicable to the societies that, that are intended for this particular money. So we are looking at how do we ensure that in achieving this contextually applicable financing, that we apply what we call an intersectional frame of analysis, where we are looking at transforming power relations, but also considering gender identities, looking at race, looking at class, looking at geographical locations, because when you think about some of the development financing, for instance, and in the case of Uganda that we have been receiving over the years, particularly when it comes to the issue of renewable energies, we found that there is increased land dispossession. A lot of women have lost out on their source of livelihoods. We've seen that in addition to the land dispossession, there is loss of, for instance, water resources. And it's really because within the framework of blended finance, you find that the donors, the ordinary financing arrangements that we have been operating under, there is frameworks for accountability. But for the private sector, there is really no sufficient frameworks for accountability. And so that is one of the things that then needs to be addressed to strengthen that particular corporate accountability aspect, to ensure that private financiers are also responsive to the needs of those that are at the margins. So as I summarize, it's some of the things that we propose is analyzing climate financing programs and modalities to ensure that they are gender equitable and that they also do not reinforce inequality, like I already mentioned, but also looking at the climate financing architecture to guarantee that women and indigenous people are able to access this money, this financing. And this then requires recognition that that women, that indigenous people, that the solutions that they advance are, to recognize the solutions that they advance, because so many times we see that as recipients of financing, we are also recipients of solutions, and yet they are already solutions that we have. And a very good example is the solution of agroecology. Our agriculture sector today is being taken over by foreign private sector, advancing certain technologies that are leading to loss of, for instance, indigenous seeds, and yet we already have some of these solutions to enhancing production and productivity. So really recognizing the already existing solutions and committing to advancing them. Later on, I'll talk about some of the visible and invisible barriers that we are seeing, and I'll be able to then unpack further, particularly when you think about the approach of leveraging on private financing, how that needs to be transformed to be more responsive, and whether to even consider leveraging on private finance to address a social challenge like the climate problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Faith, and very powerful what you've just indicated, and so well structured in terms of some of the key barriers. Now, I want to have a panel conversation, and Monica, if you want to come in, please do, because you're here diligently with us, and I know how difficult it is when you're zoomed in. So what I want to do now is move into, okay, so what does this now mean in order to really go towards speed and scale? Both unpacking some of those key tensions and the barriers. And I want to focus on some of the things you said, Faith, so that I can move to you, Runa, but I do want to make this a free-flowing conversation rather than just too structured. So let's try to do that, because I know we can all build on each other's thoughts and come out with something quite powerful, I hope. One is the leveraging of private finance, which Faith has clearly indicated, and that's your department. And trying to ensure that we optimize both private and public, and we de-risk some of this finance. What I really liked from you, Faith, and I'm hearing this time and time again, having just worked actually with the global leaders on their decision on the new forestry partnership. So many indigenous leaders and community leaders have said, stop coming into our countries and telling us what our solutions are without asking us about the solutions that we already have, in particular in the area of agriculture and also in the area of energy. We know how many indigenous solutions, whether we look at seeds, whether we look at regenerative practices in the agricultural sector, or whether we look at micro energy possibilities rather than large macro infrastructural shifts. So how do we start leveraging this and making sure that we don't just come in with our big boots and say, this is the way we need to do it, rather than listening to people on the ground who have been part of the soil and understanding what the solutions are? Runa, you can start first.
The way we do it is we invest in companies on the ground. So we don't come in with international companies. We invest in Egyptian companies or Nigerian companies or Kenyan companies. And most of the time, we're a minority investor. So we let our excellent management teams lead the way to how we do things and how we grow the company, and also in the solutions that we have to find in gender and climate change and items like that. But I want to make one point, which is that, like my fellow panelists said, I don't think we can get there if we say this is climate finance, and in the private sector it means large-scale infrastructure finance. I think every investment has to have a climate component, and every investment has to have a gender component, because frankly, the studies that have been done is that diverse management teams, diverse boards lead to higher returns. So in the private sector, we compete on returns, but the information that actually, if we bring in women at all levels, it will lead to better returns has to get out there. We certainly find it in our companies. The number of women we've grown on boards, on senior management teams, as employees, and the number of companies that we've asked to focus on goods and services specifically about women, and really making sure that the people who actually develop those goods and services are women. 80% of the consumer decisions in the world are made by women. Why don't we have women develop some of these for other women? So it's very important to get out this information. Climate change. What we find is that we have competitors in our business who basically are out of business because they didn't think about climate change. They didn't think about erosion. They didn't think about where their workers were coming from. They didn't think about a lot of things. And actually, by putting that in the investment idea, you actually make better profits. So we have to absolutely think about every decision has to have both things in there and the intersection of those. So we know that, and we find that in our investments, that most of our in our companies, the people who are working on these areas are women. We find they're passionate, drives the whole company along, including the boards. Women do, research has shown, tend to be allies in this area. So why not get them in? There's an intersection there. And similarly, climate change, we have to make sure that when we do certain things, it includes the idea of inclusivity towards women. So do no harm, but also use the energy that comes from both of these things and creating jobs to make sure that both of them are lifted up and there's a just transition.
Thank you, Runa. So I think the key message as you've finished here in terms of the do no harm is one, let's remember that women are often victims, but they do not want to be victimized. They want to be the solution providers because they know what to do on the ground. And so Amar, I'm going to turn to you. Here in Egypt, how are you taking this into consideration in terms of your work moving forward? And where would you see the synergies with all of those here on the panel so that we can optimize our efforts?
Certainly. I'm going to pick up where I stopped actually because I was trying to build a foundation for this closer. And basically, what I was explaining at the beginning, I was talking about the financial inclusion solid foundation where today we have a digital platform, we have a legal framework, we have formal groups, we formalize the groups, we have seamless digital payments, we have individual credit history, we have financial group profiles, things that we never had before. So basically, what we have tried to build in place today is just a foundation to build on top. So one of the unbeatable advantages of the VSLA model is basically the weekly meetings that those women meet together mandatory every week. And we have a moderator, a very well-trained moderator that actually moderates the whole year with these ladies. We are using this entry point to actually start to introduce new learnings to those women about environment-friendly projects, profitable projects, sustainable projects, simple projects that they can actually do within their villages that will reward not only economical, but also will reward a better life for their siblings and loved ones within the village itself. So the model that we have actually put together today is inclusive of technology with a platform for financial inclusion, because we certainly need access to finance, and the lady here sitting next to me, you will want some credit history about anything so you can actually fund those women. So what we've been doing is basically constructing this foundation. Okay, one thing very important, we're also working on different models like post-harvesting village centers, where women can get together actually and create a value add to the crops that are actually there already, that they've been farmed by their brothers and their uncles and their fathers, but there is so much waste in the supply chain or in the logistics of these movements of vegetables and fruits. So something that we really feel that we can create great added value. I just would like to add here that availing gender smart and socially inclusive climate or green finance, actually this needs a lot of ground readiness, needs a lot of networking, and needs a lot of scaling up, as I mentioned. We do not want to get back to the cycle of small and micro proof of concept initiatives. We've had enough of those. We've succeeded with many of those. And this is what we have been trying to do at the NCW. In the development world, and I just want to reflect on one last thing that you have said just right now that hit me. In the development world in the 70s and the 80s, there was an approach called the blueprint approach. Many people hated this blueprint approach. In the 90s, there was a revolution around the grassroots. And as you said, no one comes with big boots and tells me what to do. We understand what we need to do. However, after 30 years of grassroots development, we need to learn something. We cannot continue like this. The technology available today and the science, the advancement of science and the available tools out there are not available to these ladies. They might not know about them. There needs to be a mix between the blueprint approach and the grassroots approach, where we actually guide those women forward and introduce new offerings and new ideas to create a profitable value add chain for their villages and women. One last thing. In the mid-80s, a gentleman in the name of Muhammad Yunus, a Nobel Prize winner 2006, built an empire for the poor using pen and paper. Can you imagine what we can do today with all the technology available that is provided to us? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Let me just move now back to Faith, and building on what you've just said, Amar, I would just make one qualification. And Monica, put your hand up when you're ready, then you want to speak. One is we do need to continuously come back to basics. We need to make sure women are having access to that technology, are having access to education, and are having access to knowledge. Let's not assume that they are, because they're not in many cases. Fully agree that there needs to be a mix of new technologies and new scientific thinking with indigenous knowledge and community knowledge, because they're the ones that are actually the caretakers on the ground. And so how do we optimize that? And Faith, I'd like to come to you and see where you're seeing that there are some actual work in this direction, where we're able to bring in this melting pot of knowledge and ensure that actually women take it, have access to it, and move forward. But also, where are some of the barriers, both visible and invisible?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to just pick it up from the former speaker's submission and to say that yes, indeed, there is acknowledgement that it's possible to adopt that blended approach where we do consider solutions, indigenous solutions, as well as new technologies. The challenge that we have seen is that increasingly these technologies actually not being provided to us free. So we do have indigenous technologies that we have been using for centuries, and they have contributed towards sustaining not only ourselves but also the planet. But we found ourselves in a scenario where, because of neoliberalism and capitalism, everything is being put in the marketplace. And so there is a desire to constantly extract from indigenous people and local communities. And so this is why the pushback is really to say that we can't always be extracted from and then sold back to, because this is something that has been happening for centuries. And so it's important to recognize and commit to supporting the indigenous solutions that exist and recognize the rights and interests of local people without actually completely transforming the ways in which they are operating. So for me, I think that's one thing I would like to emphasize, because in any case, when you think about technology transfer, even within the World Trade Organization agreement, the developed countries are supposed to be transferring technology to developing countries, but that is not happening. Even within the technology negotiations, that is not something that developed countries are willing to commit to. And so that's why it's important to address this issue around power. The power imbalance is what is actually impeding developing countries from being able to move forward, from being able to be resilient against multiple crises that we are constantly faced with. I also wanted to speak to add on to my previous submission around the issue of blended finance. And I think it was Amali who actually indicated that most of their financing is going to middle-income countries. And that's what the statistics show. When you think about how much money is coming to least developed countries, it's very, very minimal from development financial institutions. As at 2019, we were receiving only about 9% of private finance within least developed countries. And this is really because there are a number of barriers that exist within our setting, particularly when it comes to being able to mobilize private capital. But again, it's because their interests. Because when you look at our situation as least developed countries, as African countries, investing in some of these regions is not as profitable. And yet when we speak about addressing climate finance, it shouldn't be about profits. It should be about people. We should be putting social interests forward, but that's not the case. And so because private financiers are really also interested in the idea of ensuring that there is high rate of return. Again, when you look at the sectors that are attracting a lot of this investment, it's really energy, the banking sector, not some of the social sectors that are critical when it comes to addressing the impacts of the climate crisis. So for me, it's to say that, like was already indicated earlier, and I think I liked what you said when you said we need to begin to put people first, the planet, but then I wanted to change the last bit and say prioritization of the most marginalized, because at this point, it should be about all of us being responsible for the most marginalized. Climate finance is, yes, about addressing climate needs, but it's also about responsibility. And this is why it's the responsibility of developed countries to provide the climate financing. In the arrangement of blended, and I'm finalizing, in the arrangement of leveraging on private finance, one of the fears that we see is that there is going to be a transfer of responsibility. And like I indicated, there is already accountability mechanisms to hold developed countries accountable, to hold donors accountable. But the framework of accountability to hold private sector accountable is not strong enough. And unless we do address that, and for instance, addressing it by supporting and putting in place the UN legally binding Treaty on Business and Human Rights, then we will not be able to achieve what it is that we are talking about at this moment.
Faith.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very powerful intervention. And I would like to say that you started off by saying we need to stop a system which is neoliberal and capitalist. And clearly, coming from the Club of Rome, who were the first who published the limits to growth and the need for a new economic system, that's really music to my ears. And I want to come to you now, Molly, because we are talking about that second P that I brought into my 3 Ps. It's the power and the profit, which does not enable the prosperity for more. It only enables the profit for a few. If we're going to come back to the space and the need for climate finance with a gender lens and directed towards women, how do we do that within this current financial system? What really needs to change?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that probably need to change, but maybe I'll just give an example of what we as a DFI are doing, working with others. I mentioned, for those that don't know us, we're probably one of, if not the biggest private equity investor in sub-Saharan Africa. And that means we bring not just finance and capital, but we bring expertise, and we engage and we support and work with different funds in particular to help them do more of what needs to happen. And we're able to really amplify and drive impact through these types of financial intermediaries. And I just want to draw an example to one that we closed just recently. It's Africa Forest Investment Platform. It's the first, I think, sustainable forestry investment platform in Africa. We've partnered with New Forest, who've worked a lot in Southeast Asia, also in the US, and also Norfund and FinFund. And actually, we've been designing this from the start. We've committed to collectively $200 million US, and we hope to raise a further $500 million US to do these sustainable forestry investments. But a big part of this is also going to be some technical assistance, as well as the impact incentive framework that we have set at the fund level. So in terms of the impact, we have placed gender and diversity as one of the core 4 impact themes, which the fund must deliver, must report on, and of course brings that accountability, alongside community and livelihoods, as well as biodiversity, and also looking at emission reductions associated with reduced unsustainable use of wood and forest products. And I think, this is a key example of what we need to do much more of. As a DFI, this is exactly what we like to be doing, and we need to start to see other investors coming into these types of really very impactful funds. The role of technical assistance, I think, also is critical. We talk a lot about blended finance, and that is going to be very important in many cases. Technical assistance where you can help build capacity and understanding, but also help to bring out some of the solutions that already exist at the community level to help create visibility, to allow greater scale up of financing of those is also important. And so we will be looking alongside this fund of, of $500 million at a technical assistance facility around sustainable landscapes and livelihoods. And I just want to give one, I could not agree more on the importance of indigenous knowledge and indigenous solutions. In my previous role at the Inter-American Development Bank, I saw this very visibly. I had, a huge honor to go and visit some of our projects in Guatemala in particular. And to be honest, it brought tears to my eyes when I turned up and these women and children who were thanking me as the chief of the climate division. It was incredibly humbling, thanking me for helping them to better access finance to actually start to help replicate what they knew were the solutions, but they weren't able to access the funding. And not only for their community, but critically, they were then bringing and engaging with other female communities across the region in Guatemala to help them also understand. And this was really about helping increase protein in the diet through more indigenous, a particular type of chicken that actually thrives in the dry conditions of the Yara dry valley in Guatemala, but because of new practices that they'd lost that indigenous sort of knowledge, it become very, not the norm. But they knew this was the solution, and small amounts of seed funding enabled them not just to step this up for themselves, but start to engage others across the country. It was incredibly humbling, particularly for a country like Guatemala, where they have very, I think probably one of the worst malnutrition rates in the world.
Thank you, Amali, and I think we could all do with a lot more humility in this space, so I very much appreciate your remarks. I want to turn to you, Anne, and I want to finish on your final reflections on how we can enhance partnerships coming from your perspective. I'm going to bring in just a couple questions, and then we'll finish with which I hope we'll have the Vice President of Operations of the Caribbean Development Bank with us in a few minutes. Wonderful, you were here. Thank you, sir. So please, Anne, just a few quick reflections on partnerships so we can take a couple of questions.
Yeah, thanks very much. So one of the things that the Voices for Just Climate Action, which is an initiative that Faith and I think some others in this room are all involved in, that we've been doing over the past year, is to start to look at local finance institutions that have the potential to channel democratically governed and inclusive climate finance to women and other priority rights holders like Indigenous peoples and young people. And we've already identified some promising mechanisms, whether they're ones that already exist, set up by local government or district government, or ones that have been set up by civil society. Some of them need further reform and more work, but we think that there is a lot of potential for these types of institutions to work with larger climate funding agencies to get more money into the hands of women and young people. Second is that here at COP27, together with the Avena Foundation and some other partners, we're also launching a new initiative to try to make it easier for women's organizations and indigenous peoples groups and other rights holder organizations to compile the evidence of climate impact and social impact that they need to access the funding even once it's there. And that's often one of the most time-consuming and off-putting parts of the whole process, because quite a rigorous standard of evidence of impact is needed. And it's very difficult for grassroots organizations to compile that kind of evidence to the standard that financiers need to show that their funds are returning an impact for the planet and for people. So we're really looking forward to that initiative, which will also involve continuous dialogue with funding institutions, with government, with civil society groups, with rights holders, to learn from that whole process. I think, coming away from today, I think one of the most important things that needs to happen is that we need to move from these kinds of discussions to actually looking at concrete targets, changes in incentives, changes in policies of financing institutions at every level, from international to national to local, so that we can make gender transformative climate investment a reality. And we've done a little bit of work on this. We're doing some more research at a national level next year, and we would love to work together with others to really come up with meaningful and robust targets and incentives so that we can really start to shift the reality. And we would love to work with others who are interested in that piece. And that includes, by the way, I mean, it was great to hear the vice president of the EIB making a joke about the European Environment Bank. But we do need faster action from public financing institutions. Yeah. I was part of an event earlier this week where research was unveiled showing that not a single African public finance institution has a clear target or no-go policy on getting out of fossil fuel investment. So we really need action on that front as well. We need money to shift out of fossil fuels and deforestation, which are not gender smart or climate smart, just as much as we need it to shift into adaptation and loss of damage funding on grant or highly concessional terms.
Thank you, Anne, and absolutely, and I think that that's why it is incredible, and probably why I did make the Freudian slip, because the EIB has pulled out of fossil investments. So I do believe that they are fundamentally a climate and environmental bank, and let's hope they continue to show that leadership and that other MDBs follow suit. So I'm just going to take one or two questions. I've got one here, and I've got one in the back. Those were the two that came forward, and I apologize if I haven't taken your hand. If the other two actually, if we go very fast, introduce yourself and please give a question, not a reflection.
Hello, could you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
My name is Laura Ripani from the Inter-American Development Bank that works with Latin America and the Caribbean. Actually, Amal Lee was part of the bank before, so nice to see you again. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, there is going to be like 15 million net jobs created by 2030 when we move to a low-carbon economy. But at the moment, preliminary analysis that we made say that only a fourth of the green jobs that are now in the region are held by women. So 75% are held by men. So my question to you is, what can we do to intentionally change this, right? So how we can promote more access to green jobs for women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good question. And Runa, I want you to answer that. Not yet. I'm going to take other questions, and there's one here. Yes, in the back, please. Thank you for passing the microphone around. We appreciate that.
Thank you very much. My name is Cesar Katebe, representing Women's Life Wellness Foundation. My question is directed at the gentleman or professor at the end. How can blended finance help in accelerating gender climate smart and socially inclusive climate financing, taking into account that climate crisis affects the marginalized, and these are women? How can this platform be able to sort of advantage, or women, how can this process be able to ensure that it leverages the marginalized to ensure that they move out of poverty, taking into account that climate crisis is something that they are grappling with?
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to answer those two questions very quickly because we need to then move on to have our closing remarks. You want to start?
Okay. I'll be very quick. I find that with new industries, it's almost like because they're new and they're startup and so on and so forth, they don't have to abide by any other rules. You look at technology, you know, they were scrappy young, so they didn't have to hire women. So you have a whole industry that has very few women. In the green technology side, I think the same is true. And the way to change that is to hold them accountable through shareholder action, people who are investors, and generally civil society.
I'm going to also turn to Amali on that question, and I would like to also remind everyone that we need to redefine what both green and social jobs are. Let's remember that the care economy is not included in the existing economy most of the time. That needs to be fundamentally part of the existing economy and the jobs creation. Amali.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with all of that and the points Runa made. And I think, you know, as investors, we can really drive that. But I think at the same time, just going back to my previous point, we may also need to be proactive and partner with those who can bring the relevant training and skills. So we invested in a renewable energy platform in India. It was the utility scale renewables. Actually very successful. It's mobilized a lot of private capital now in its second raise. But importantly, alongside that, we trained women to around jobs, some more senior and technical jobs in the renewables industry as well. And that was a training program. We partnered with our shareholder, DFID, at the time. And that was a really important part of that. So I think, you know, we shouldn't underestimate those aspects as well.
Thank you. Few reflections, very quick.
Yeah, just to answer your question regarding the platform, as I said, is a foundation. This platform actually has an incredible amount of data that we have collected from areas that we could not do before. And hence, the attraction for finance for climate change, environment-friendly projects like the post-harvesting village centers that I've explained that we are scaling up in the thousands across the villages. These are the types of projects that actually we want women to carry out in the next few years to be able to be economically safe, to be able to understand the situation around her in terms of the hazards that are taking place around it, and at the end of the day to be support for her family that actually also needs a lot of support in these times of climate change that we are all witnessing. I hope I answered your question. We can take a side talk if you would like afterwards.
Wonderful. So first of all, may I give a round of applause for our incredible panel. And as I introduce the Vice President of Operations, Caribbean and Development Bank, Isaac Solomon, I do want to conclude with one thought. Let's not forget the integrated approach of the social and the climate and the gender. They all go together. That is why we know that good social jobs are good green jobs, that both of them are good female jobs, delivering women back into the economy where they belong and giving them the right role of being on the front line of bringing solutions to both our community issues and the need to really unpack the complex challenges that we have before us. So this is not just about gender impact in a very limited sense. This is about bringing women into the forefront of the decisions that we need across the economy, our financial system, and our political systems. Sir, can I ask you to come to the podium? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me apologize for not being here at the very beginning. I was at another panel that went over. We know how these things are at COP. Ladies and gentlemen, I am sure you would agree that this was a stimulating side event at COP27. On behalf of the management and staff of the Caribbean Development Bank, I thank the European Investment Bank, the Council of Europe Development Bank, and Hivos for hosting this event and for the opportunity for CDB to participate in the dialogue. I want to thank all of the panelists for sharing their experiences in accelerating gender-smart climate finance and for information on the status of gender-smart climate finance, as well as their calls to action. We heard a lot of it a while ago. Climate change, the food crisis, and the conflict in Ukraine are just a few of the colossal challenges facing humanity today, persisting in the face of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The world is currently struggling from the effects of rising energy costs and global inflation. From every corner of the globe, women and vulnerable people bear the brunt of these impacts. We must do something. As we have heard, the proportion of gender-responsive and socially inclusive climate finance is still too low. We therefore must do better to accelerate gender-smart and socially inclusive financing and in ensuring accountability and action. In the Caribbean, the word rally is special for us. It is a call to action for unity that is required now more than ever to ensure the security and prosperity of our people. I highlighted this in my opening address at our recently concluded side event addressing this very same topic. So I call on us in this global space to rally to deliver investments that build the adaptive capacity and climate resilience of women, girls, and vulnerable communities. Our investments should be well targeted from the start to benefit all women while facilitating an inclusive, integrative, and equitable ecosystem. So where do we go from here? One of the things that CDB's president, Dr. Hyginus Leon, has triggered in our minds at the bank is the concept of deliberate haste. As I listen to the speakers and panel's perspectives on concrete examples of how investment and finance flows can better reach those who are the most affected by climate change, the need for deliberate haste came to mind. As one of my staff members said, deliberate haste is about delivering solutions now to change lives. This is absolutely critical to push solutions that truly accelerate gender-smart and socially inclusive climate finance. One of the very strong positions that came across during the panel discussion is the need to rapidly deepen the partnerships around applying gender lens in order to unlock substantial private equity for women as they grow their businesses, trade, and support their wider contributions to society. And this is quite within reach. We were reminded not to forget local ownership of solutions across different levels. And we are already seeing some expansion of partnerships. CDB is pleased to be well advanced in becoming a catalyst regional investor to the 2X Collaborative's flagship growth fund for the Caribbean, Portland Equity Fund 3, the world's largest gender impact investors. Let me add that gender accountability applies to private equity and finance flows. Investors must demonstrate greater focus on gender. CDB calls for more partnering in expanding solutions that enable greater attention to gender equality. Like others in the MDB's working group on gender, we value the panel's dialogue and sharing of good practice in and commitments to advancing gender-smart and socially inclusive public and private investments. For us in the Caribbean, the composite gender finance nexus has not scaled. An examination of blended climate finance transactions in 2021 by Convergence, the global network for climate finance, indicated that women tend to be indirect beneficiaries in blended finance transactions for gender and climate change. As we wrap up this event, allow me to say something about culture. We know how difficult it is to shift norms and behaviors that impede inclusion, or just being so accustomed to approaching things a particular way without realizing how quickly we need to adapt and make system and behavioral changes. But I want to stress that by normalizing gender inclusion practices in climate finance and gender-focused investing, we are helping to shift the culture. We must seize on the opportunities and challenges for female and male entrepreneurs to access climate finance and practices of inclusion that can change our future. CDB continues to work with development financing institutions in scaling up gender lens investing and implementing gender policies or programs. I close by returning to something that I said at our side event last week. It is time for a reset. Gender smart and socially inclusive public and private climate investment is a game changer. Gender smart climate investment is smart business and can deliver better climate, gender equality, and social inclusion outcomes. So let's make the change. Thank you very much.
so much. Thank you so much, Vice President Solomon. And I'd like to now close this session. We are 5 minutes over. I apologize for that, but I think we did pretty well, actually sticking to time. I want to thank again this incredible panel and also the sponsors of this event, the European Investment Bank, Hivos, and also the CEB. Have a lovely day. Thank you.